Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Hello and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Heather Hayes, pastor of First Presbyterian Church here in Cedar Rapids, and your moderator for this morning. Over the past 5 years or so, the local food movement seems to be taking the Cedar Rapids community by storm. There has been an expansion of the downtown and area farmers markets, the formation of the Iowa Valley Food Cooperative, CSAs, or community-supported agriculture, farms are increasingly the norm. And in just the past year, we've seen a lot of media buzz around the opening of Fresh Market, the branch of the new Pioneer Co-op here in town, as well as the expansion in the health market sections of some of our local Hy-Vees. All of this would seem to point to a renaissance in fresh, local, organic food options in our area, as well as an increased demand for those options. But despite this growth in selection, it is not always the case that the selection is accessible across the economic diversity that exists within our community. With me this morning is David Bullwinkle, professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College. Welcome, David. Good morning. Sonia Kendrick, founding farmer of Feed Iowa First. Good morning. And Clint Twedt-Ball, one of the co-founders of Matthew 25. Welcome, Clint. Together, we will be considering some of the challenges that are faced in making healthy food options available to all members of our community, how lack of accessibility impacts or doesn't impact such measures as community health and wellness, and we will consider what our responsibilities are to one another. So why don't we just jump right in and name some of the challenges to making these healthy food options available across our economic spectrum or the community spectrum. Would any of you like to jump in with a comment on some of the challenges that we face?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, Matthew 25 received funding from the USDA to do a study of what were the barriers to access for people in the lower income neighborhoods in Cedar Rapids. And what came back was a couple of things. Number one was that access in terms of, is it close, is it in proximity to you? And there are several places that have been called food deserts by the USDA here in Cedar Rapids. The second was time, and did people really have time to prepare that food? And then the third was cost, and could they afford to have that food in their house? So.
Well, I know, Clint, at Matthew 25, you are creating an urban farm. Can you speak a little bit more to how you see that impacting the accessibility in terms of area?
Sure. So at Matthew 25, we talk about the fact that we live in the middle of a neighborhood where there are train tracks that bring trains full of grain to mills lining the Cedar River. And yet, right next to those train tracks are a whole lot of homes where people don't have access to food, and where the food culture is not necessarily one of having healthy choices. And so you see this correlation between the fact that the lowest income people in our community are also the ones that struggle the most with obesity and being overweight because of the food options that are available to them. So Matthew 25 is kind of taking a two-pronged approach. First, we've created the state's first urban farm that is growing fresh produce in the middle of a food desert, and it has a playground on it, and this theme of play with your food, trying to get kids to interact with their food. We've also done 5 school gardens so that we can be on site at schools where we can have kids interact with their food and kind of learn about fresh fruits and vegetables. So.
Well, in Lynn County alone, according to Feeding America, we have almost 26,000 people that go to bed hungry. In Iowa, as a state, we have 400,000 people. And these are the working poor, these are our elderly, these are our mentally and physically handicapped people, and It's just people with bad luck. And when we sit on the best soil literally on the planet, there is no reason why there should be anyone that is hungry here.
Sonia, can you speak a little bit to what Feed Iowa First does and how with their approach to getting good, fresh foods in the hands of people who are in need, who are going to bed hungry?
Well, fundamentally, Feed Iowa First believes that hunger is a solvable issue. In Linn County, the 26,000 people that go to bed hungry, to feed them 2.5 cups of vegetables, it would require us to farm about 500 acres. And I don't have 500 acres. But there's over 800 acres just surrounding the churches in our community. We did a GIS, Geographical Information Survey of Cedar Rapids, Marion, and Hiawatha. And there's over 800 acres just surrounding the churches. And so we partner with churches, and we partner with businesses like Rockwell Collins and GE Capital and SPS in Marion to turn their underutilized land into production for people who don't have access. And also the people who are participating in this also get to learn. So it's education and community outreach.
One of the things that I hear in between some of this is the idea of cost and the cost of food. Many of the places that, the fresh markets, the new pies, the cost of the local food or the local organic food seems to be quite a bit higher as a price point. And but you seem to be suggesting there are ways in which that those foods can be made accessible for a lower cost.
First, I want to make the point that Fresh Market is a subsidiary of Target. It's not an outward benefit to our community. I apologize. What was the question again?
That there are other ways, that it doesn't necessarily need to be the higher price point that you might see as a premium organic local product versus what you seem to be doing to
So what you're trying to say is that food can become less expensive?
Or more, less expensive, more accessible to a person who maybe doesn't have a budget where they could go into a store and pay a premium cost.
I think that we can work on accessibility, but the affordability, food is too cheap. I'm an advocate for farmers as well. And the cost of our food is, America spends about 6.8% of their wages on food. And the rest of the world spends about 40% of their wages on food. So our farmers are not making a sustainable living farming. And that's why we have slave labor in the form of undocumented workers.
Which is another justice issue in and of itself. David, do you want to hop in here too?
Sure, yeah. The one thing that I would add is that even if it were possible to bring down the price of fresh foods like whole vegetables and fruits and whole grains and so on, those products would still not really be able to compete in price with the processed foods that you find sort of in the middle of the supermarket. When you go from the produce aisle to the chips aisle or the soda aisle, I mean, this is an observation that's been made by people like Michael Pollan, the food writer. You can buy a lot more calories in the chips aisle and the soda aisle for the same money than you can in the produce aisle. So I think that we need to find, I agree with Sonia that we need to find a different approach to solving this problem of getting low-income people access to healthy foods, an approach that's different from simply trying to make fresh food cheaper, because that in the end won't be a sustainable model, because if farmers can't survive growing the food that we want to eat and that we would like all people to have access to, that food won't become available, or it'll have to be brought in from outside, which will add to the price of it.
Now, what it sounds like you're moving into then is the need to change how we understand and think about food, not just in one particular economic sense, but across the spectrum as a community, as a country, in terms of what we value, how we understand what is healthy and good, and how much we should be paying for that.
Well, food is energy, so when we cut food off from its source, it starts degrading. So the closer we eat to the source, the more energy that we get from the food. So that's one of the reasons why we need to eat locally. Just for an example of the unaffordability and the unsustainability of our current system, this year Feed Iowa First produced almost 30,000 pounds of vegetables and donated them to the community for free. Had we sold those vegetables at organic prices, it would have been $53,000 worth of vegetables. And we would have had to take out about $13,000 from that profit to pay for our seeds and all the inputs. And so that left us with about $40,000 and 150 man hours a week. So to me, as a farmer, I can choose to sell my vegetables to people who can afford them, which is not the people who really always need them. Or I can give them and be a servant to my community, to the people who actually need them.
May I ask a question? So this is for both of you. Just now, Clint, you mentioned the idea of a food culture. And before the show this morning, Sonia, you talked about the food system. And I just wonder if those are concepts that are familiar to viewers of this program. What is a food culture and what is the food system?
Yeah, well, I think of food culture as kind of that kind of like the air that you breathe. What is the culture around you? What are the things that are easily accessible? What are the parents teaching their children? You know, so if you live in a food desert in a lot of places, what that often means is that the easy choices that you have are fast food restaurants or the local convenience store, that's where you get a lot of your cheap, high-calorie food. And the more difficult things to access are the grocery stores that are, you know, we think of them as relatively close, a mile or two away if you have a car, but if you don't have a car or transportation, it's much more difficult to get there. So trying to shift the food culture is about, in part, what Sonia is talking about of, you know, we've kind of taken food and put it out in other places as this thing that people grow for us. How do we shift the culture so that it's okay to grow food in your front yards? It's okay to grow it in the right of way. It's okay to have other places throughout the community where it's grown and accessible.
So my master's is in sustainable food systems, and I guess I'm telling you, and I can pretty much sum up the problem that we have with what I call my can of corn speech. So a can of sweet corn, food is energy measured in calories, so is fossil fuels measured in calories. So a can of sweet corn requires about 1,000 calories to be produced, but you only get 120 calories out of it because of what we have is an industrialized transportation-based food system. So the average miles on the Iowa plate is about 1,500 miles. So we are literally eating fossil fuels, in so to speak. So this is not sustainable in that our world populations are increasing. We are projected to hit 9 billion by 2050. And those 9 billion people are all consumers of energy, fossil fuel, unless we come up with an alternative resource. And so since we have an industrialized food system that's globalized, we have to be in line with everyone else for our food. while we have the capacity to change our system so that we feed ourselves first, what does it matter if we feed the world? If Iowa feeds the world with our corn, if we cannot feed ourselves? And we did at one time, and we can do it again. In one county in Iowa, we can feed the entire Midwest with vegetables, and we have to do it again because California is coming offline.
Well, I know it seems like we've just barely scratched the surface here with some issues around accessibility. Accessibility both in terms of cost of food systems and the need to change food systems, also in terms of changing the culture of individuals to understand how food impacts themselves and their community. Let's turn now to what may be some of the impacts of lack of access to healthy food sources. Are there particular outcomes that can be expected when people are given access to healthy food sources? And I'm wondering if David would like to speak to that a little bit?
Well, I certainly can try. I have a feeling that my
I can see Sonia
panelists
chomping
here
at the bit.
might be better qualified to do that. So the concept of food deserts that's been mentioned a couple of times here really came to prominence due to the efforts of First Lady Michelle Obama to draw attention to the problem of childhood overweight and obesity. So she has sponsored the Let's Move program, trying to get schools to change the culture of food and also the culture of activity or exercise. So with her Let's Move program, she has made a connection between lack of access to fresh food and the growing problem of, well, it's a bad pun, but the growing problem of overweight and obesity. That said, there are some skeptics. We might note that according to the USDA's way of mapping food deserts, only about, I think, 4.5% of people in Lynn County live in food deserts, according to the USDA. But the prevalence of overweight and obesity is surely much higher than that. I think somewhere between a third and half of the population. So overweight and obesity can't be caused exclusively by the problem of food deserts or by the problem of lack of access to healthy food. So surely it doesn't help people if they can't easily get fresh food, but there are other factors that we need to pay attention to if we want to try to deal with the problem of overweight and obesity.
Nutritional epidemiologists is kind of a new science, and when a person thinks about America, they don't think of them as a developing country, they think of them as a developed country. And when we think about hungry people, we often think about maybe somebody in Africa who looks hungry. That's what hungry looks like. But the reality is that when your body doesn't get the nutrients and the macronutrients that it needs, it continues to tell you that you're hungry. So if you have a lot of empty calories, you're going to continue to eat because you're hungry. And you will not be satiated because
your body's still craving those
Right.
additional nutrients.
Right, and it's not just obesity. We are linking heart disease, diabetes, and multiple other conditions to malnourishment. So I'm a plant scientist, and when they taught us how to determine nutrient deficiency in the field by looking at plants, I believe that we just do not know how to recognize nutrient deficiency in humans.
I think the other thing that I'd add to that is that, you know, I'm a United Methodist pastor by training, and so I believe a lot in holistic health and this mind-body-spirit connection. And I think that when you don't eat healthy, you don't not just feel physically healthy, but you don't feel healthy in terms of outlook on life and that type of thing. And so it's a huge, huge issue when we have some of the lowest income folks that are then eating the most unhealthy food, and some of the children that most need to receive a great education are then not really feeling great about going to school or having the energy for school and learning, and all of that is connected, I think.
It's systematic
Right.
across the culture. I'm going to actually ask you to talk a little bit more. We've talked a little bit about the health and personal aspects, but what do you see as some of the impacts, as you've worked with Matthew 25, of getting the ability to access food sources or to grow your own food in a community, how that changes the community spirit itself?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to go back to what Sonia said a little bit about. We used to do this in the U.S. and in Iowa. You know, when people came back from war, World War II, they had victory gardens. There were people that knew how to do canning and all those food preservation things, and we've kind of lost that. The way to get the cheapest food is to grow it yourself and to be able to preserve it yourself. And I think when we go into schools and work with kids, kids are excited about food. They, when they come to the farm, we had a group of middle schoolers come to the farm, and there were about 17 of them, and they quickly found the raspberry patch, and about 14 of them were attracted like bees to the honey, and they started eating the raspberries, and the 3 kind of hung back and were like, what is that? Those look prickly, I'm not used to grabbing things off of a bush outside. Finally, when we kind of coaxed them over and they saw their friends eating, they started grabbing them by the handfuls. When kids get out and they can pull a tomato off, they can pull a pepper off, they can taste it, they realize that these things that maybe don't taste quite as good when they've been transported for 1,500 miles taste awesome straight out of the ground. And there's just looks of joy on their face, and it's not unusual. I've experienced it with my daughter, that when she's tried something fresh, she wants to come home and tell me about it and see if I want to cook that or taste it myself. So it has a huge impact.
Well, as we start heading towards the end of our program, I just want to throw out one sort of final question for you all. If you would weigh in on your thoughts on what kind of ethical or moral obligation do we have as a community supporting one another to make sure that these kinds of foods are accessible across the economic spectrum?
You addressed that before the show. Do you want to go first, Sonia?
I believe what we do to the least in our community reflects what we do unto God.
That sounds like Matthew 25.
Yeah. I might have heard that at my church too.
So, the reality is that, yeah, we do need to take care of the people that are food insecure in our community. But the even larger reality is that our whole community needs to start taking care of itself. And nobody's going to do that for us except for us. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I say we should feed Iowa first.
Well, yeah, I would. I certainly agree with what you've said, and I could run through a whole list of philosophical theories that try to give different sorts of justifications for the idea that we do have a moral obligation to help those who are least well off among us, without appealing to God or religious beliefs. Probably the most important among those is the idea that people have a right to food, because it is a necessity of life, and without it a person can't live, and without healthy food, if a person is reduced to begging for food or eating food that other people have thrown away, the idea is that rights are there to protect our dignity as human beings. And if a person does not have secure access to food, they are forced to do things that really no human should have to do. So the right to food is an important concept. But I was reading through an article in The Economist magazine about food deserts, and then looking at the comments that followed it. And surprise, the internet reveals that there's a broad diversity of opinion about food deserts, and many people took the opportunity of this comment section after the article to blame the people who are the least well off for their problems. They said things like, well, even if you did put a grocery store nearby, those people just don't have enough sense to buy healthy food. I mean, I don't know why I'm even repeating these comments, because I find them
Distasteful?
Distasteful. I don't agree with them. But those people, these are sort of individualistically minded people who think that the way to understand the problem of overweight and obesity is to point to people's individual choices. And as I think about it, the main problem with that approach is that it ignores all of the things that we've just been talking about. The existence of a food culture where the choice of fast food just becomes normalized as the way to eat. Or it ignores the food system where food corporations are able to employ food scientists to concoct truly irresistible mixtures of fat and sugar and salt.
And make it hard for any parent to walk through the aisles of a grocery store.
We're genetically predispositioned for calories, high calories. And I think what you were trying to say that I should have said and should have expressed is that I believe in food democracy. I believe that all people have the right to eat good food. And I think when people try to blame it on other people that they don't know, what it does is it relieves them of the responsibility of having to do something about it. And so that's the easy way out of this problem. But, and that, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Okay. We have about a minute left here, so is there anything you'd like to weigh in on?
You know,
30 seconds or less, Clint?
It's a struggle for me to articulate why it is an ethical imperative. I mean, to me, it's just a no-brainer that if I'm my brother and sister's keeper, if I care about people that are my neighbors, if I care about community, then of course I want people to eat healthy food and have access to healthy food, and believe that everybody should have that same access.
I believe that whoever controls your food controls you, and that our democratic right to rule ourselves lies with our ability to feed ourselves.
Okay, well, we've obviously just begun to scratch the surface and could probably go for another half hour here to talk about where to start, what's going to make a difference. I thank you for all of your time and here this morning, and I would also like to take a moment to thank you for joining us here today, and on behalf of the Interreligious Council of Linn County, thank you very much. Have a good day.